Recently I decided I would finally develop a full indie game, and it all starts with an old prototype I made over a year ago. The concept is pretty simple. It's a 2D platformer where the character gravitates towards the closest surface within a certain range. In my opinion, this results in a pretty interesting movement system. I'm almost positive this concept would have been done before, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to throw in my own spin on things. Enough with the animations though, it's been almost 2 weeks since I started development, so let's have a look into the actual progress I've made so far. On day one, I started by creating a new project in Godot. I hadn't used Godot too much before this point, so I also just watched a quick refresher video on YouTube. It was titled, "Make your first 2D platformer game in just 10 minutes. Sure enough, 10 minutes later I had made zero progress. I just couldn't work out how to change the color of a freaking sprite. It wasn't covered in the tutorial, I just wanted to have a colorful square. It had something to do with the inbuilt gradient tool, but I worked it out in the end. After I had squares, I could finally build a test scene. In addition to their sprites, they each had a collider, and the player also had a kinematic body. I jumped right into scripting and spent a good 30 minutes just setting up the player basic movement. I added some more platforms, and by the end of testing, the player could move left, move right, and jump, all with an appropriate amount of acceleration and drag. On day 2, my next goal was to detect which floor object the player was standing on, and then find the up direction, or rather the normal vector. I started off looking into Area 2D nodes, which as somebody with a Unity background seemed like the equivalent to a trigger collider. My plan was to check what was colliding with this Area 2D node and then assess if it was a floor object or not. Unfortunately, I got quite sidetracked with how to actually reference the Area 2D node. I wanted to use a variable that pointed to the Area 2D node. This would be the go-to method in Unity for accessing data. However, in Godot, things work a little differently. So after what felt like forever struggling to find an answer, I just gave up and opted to hardcode the path variable. Of course, all of that only to realize my plan was flawed from the beginning. Using an Area 2D node was a bad idea because although it would detect what was in the general area, it wouldn't give me any useful data such as what side the player was standing on, or how close the object is to the player. These things could be calculated, but it just seemed like an excess amount of extra work. I thought back to my original prototype and remembered I probably used raycasting. So I skimmed a few videos on YouTube and read up on the general use of the raycast 2D node. Then, without too much hassle, everything was working as I planned for it. I simply had a parent node hold all of my raycast nodes, and then cycled through each one on every frame, while checking if they had hit something, and if it was closer than the previous floor object. On day 3, ground detection was now working correctly, so I thought it was time to start updating the player gravity. But before I did all that, I made some minor adjustments to the player movement, so now when the player is holding down one direction, then they start pressing the other, it will instantly switch movement directions without waiting for any deceleration. Anyway, with one more line of code, I was setting the gravity variable to be equal to the normal vector of the floor. It completely broke. I did some debugging and I found out it was my raycast normal that was returning a vector of 0, which caused the gravity to also be 0. Turns out the raycast was starting from inside the floor. So I moved the start points to inside the player character and added some code to include the player on the raycast ignore list. Obviously the floor collides with the player, so now there's no way for the start point to be inside the floor. So I went back to testing and my gravity was once again working, and better yet, the player was sticking to the walls and even upside down. However, it became obvious it was still not functioning entirely right. For some reason, the player could jump higher or lower when upside down. It didn't take me long to have my suspicions as to where my code was failing me. Before applying gravity to the player, I place a minimum and maximum limit on the gravity so it doesn't get exponentially larger the longer you fall. The way I was calculating this was by taking some value as the minimum and then multiplying that by 3 to get the maximum. For positive values this works, but when you're upside down and gravity is negative, the maximum actually becomes smaller than the minimum. I tried to fix this by changing the calculations, but it didn't seem to work. I thought then, well, there must be another issue with my code. After an hour of trying numerous things, I realized my math was just still wrong the entire time, and I finally fixed it. In the end, gravity was working on the floor and roof, but was still broken for the walls. By day 4, I had wanted to release a devlog, but realized the way I was recording my progress wasn't the best. Apart from making some changes to speed up my workflow in post, I also switched up all the applications to full screen during recording. This was the day that I made the most progress towards my vision of the prototype. It was full of fixing small bugs, which then in turn created more small bugs. To start off with, I fixed the wall gravity issue by rotating the input vector. So now when you're on the left face, pressing the left key, you will actually move upwards, which is relative left to the way that you were facing. This caused an issue with warping on the ground, but I realized quickly it was just because I missed updating a variable name when renaming stuff. The only other problem left was to update the movement drag so that the player didn't slide up and down walls. This was also a quick fix and led to the input becoming reversed while upside down. So left was right and right was left. One if statement later and I was pretty sure I had completely finished the prototype. Everything was working as expected, so I went ahead and built out a more complex test scene. Sure enough, the code continued to perform great, but the same could not be said about the visuals. After doing all the prior tests on a flat surfaces, it did not occur to me to rotate the sprite along with the floor. I implemented a quick fix to simply set the rotation of the character to that of the floor, but in the future I hope to have the rotation occur over time somehow. I finished off day 4 just by jumping around the map looking at the smallest of details to check for bugs. Unfortunately, I found one at the last moment, and even a few days later now as I edit this devlog, I still can't think of what might be the issue, so I'll just have to tackle it next time. Essentially, on certain angles, the character will move without the player input and it just jitters around. Anyway, that's all I have for this devlog. I hope to get these out weekly. Right now, other than the prototype, I have no idea on the scope or even the core game mechanic, so I would love to hear any constructive feedback on how I should continue the game going forward. If you like this video, consider subscribing and thank you for watching.